Okay, next up, I'm happy to introduce Liz Allen, who's Director of Strategic Initiatives at F1000 and newly elected Crossref board member. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed, and thank you for anyone who, I feel a bit like the Oscars, but thank you for anyone who voted for me to be on the board. I'm really interested to kind of get involved at this stage, and I hopefully have a different background and a different perspective that I can bring to Crossref at a very exciting time. So thank you very much. Yeah, and I'm also have the privilege of, or pleasure of being fairly at the end of the meeting, so I'm hoping to kind of wake you up with lots of colourful images and ideas. What I'm going to do now is just going to present a bit of an overview of some of the things that I think are kind of really important in the sort of scholarly communication publishing world at the moment. And I have a funder background initially. I currently work for F1000, which is a really innovative publisher, but we also have a number of other sort of development kind of tools. But essentially, I spent a lot of time working at the Wellcome Trust doing funding evaluation. So I have a particular view of research outputs and how to share research outputs and kind of some of the challenges in actually connecting information together and working out what comes out of funding. So I kind of have two hats, really. And I'm also going to cover a lot of the themes that have been covered today. So I think hopefully I'll bring it all together and hopefully there'll be lots of things to kind of think about. So this sounds really negative, but it's not meant to be negative. I think a lot of people have talked very much, and Adam just did a brilliant example of calling something a photograph. He used the word photograph. I came to publishing relatively recently, and I see so many words that basically confine our thinking. We talk about prints and preprints, and I'm really surprised that the word preprints really got a life when actually it's a relatively new thing. There's lots of kind of ways of sharing research and kind of, you know, there's lots of changes in formats and even things like there's been so many meetings kind of getting rid of the PDF and all these kinds of things. And there's lots of terminology that we use that I think constrains thinking. And I think often we don't actually mean what we're talking about. So there's kind of a lot of definitional issues that are really changing. And the way that we're sharing research and using the internet is really kind of opening that up. And so I think a lot of the time we constrain our thinking into old models. And I think actually there's lots of opportunities to rethink that. And then a lot of people have talked very much about the whole AI and kind of text mining, the fact that there's more content out there. We're using machine learning and algorithms in a much more intelligent kind of way, and that is really going to move quite fast. Most publishers and funders are using information to find greater precision about what they want to fund, what they're looking for. It's helping discoverability. There's so many kind of different ways of looking at research, basically spawned by the growth in research output. So this is just a really quick download of what's on the Web of Science. So you can totally see the growth in a number of articles over the last, this is like 10 years basically. So there's so much content, and this is just articles. This is life sciences, biomedical sciences outputs, and it's articles. So it's not even thinking about blogs, monographs, all the kind of other stuff that's now becoming pervasive and available and usable in the whole, you know, the kind of whole infrastructure. So the other area, this is something that I've been involved in. I've previously been involved in ORCID, and I was working with one of the also new members of the board, Amy Brand. Over the last 5 years, we started working with the ICMJE initially to think about the concepts, and this is another outdated concept. The concept of authorship is completely, again, I think it's pretty outdated, particularly in the biomedical and life sciences. This is some data from PLOS, basically showing the growth in the number of authors on articles over the last 10 years. And you can see it across all PLOS's journals. Don't look in any data buffs here, don't look in too much detail. And this slightly fills me with horror because the y-axes are all different, but the trend is basically upwards on all of them. And this, I always show this because even though it's quite old, this is from 2005. But it just kind of sums up the whole kind of issue of relying on author position and hierarchies within authorship that actually isn't really or doesn't really reflect who did what and contributed to the research. And this is all about contributing to a research article. And actually there are loads of other things that people contribute to research that in the current way that we can share research, it's not all about author position on a paper, it's about what someone contributed and what their contributions can be used and built upon in the future. So we've developed this It's called CREDIT, and it stands for the Contributor Role Taxonomy, and it's now being adopted across a number of journals in particularly in the life sciences. So PLOS have now switched this in as their contributor role algorithm when an author submits anything to a PLOS journal. And you basically choose which role your authors did, and you can have more than one. Basically it's a way of having structured information around author contributions in research. So this is another piece of metadata that wasn't there until fairly recently, and people talked about having the funder registry and really important pieces of research outputs, linking kind of contributions and pieces of research output to an individual, to an organization, to a funder, and it really does help to blow apart the whole concept of author and author position, and it reflects how research is done and being done nowadays. And then these are a couple of the other things that have been discussed quite a lot, the whole challenge of reproducibility. Again, I think Theo showed this paper, lots of issues about why reproducibility is a problem, but also it's partly because of the way research has been done in the past. Protocols weren't published, and again, Lenny talked about this kind of thing. Data wasn't published, and the whole culture of incentives within research has been to publish research and show it in the best light, and negative and null findings are often have not been published in the way they should have been published. So there's a whole kind of issue with reproducibility, which leads to massive research waste. And again, Theo actually showed this slide, only mine's a little bit more colourful. But essentially showing that research waste, particularly again in the clinical and biomedical sciences, there's estimates that as much as 85% of research is actually wasted. And this affects the funding agencies. This isn't just about publishing. This is about research getting refunded, bits of it not being funded properly, all kinds of issues there, but it's basically the whole system is not working in the most effective way. I won't dwell on this, but I think the whole thing about incentive structures in science, we all know there's lots of pressure to publish. In the past, and I think this is changing, I do have a lot of people who say this is not changing as much or as quickly as it should be, but people have relied on authors, being an author of a certain position on an article in a learned journal as being the only currency that you're judged on, or one of the main currencies that you're judged on in academia to kind of assume your next position. And actually, I think this is changing. I think the reason that has been an issue partly is because there's been nothing else in any systematic way to be able to use to kind of look at how research is being shared, and that is definitely changing as DOIs and Crossref and places like this are actually enabling research outputs to be tracked and available in much more holistic and kind of available ways. I'll just quickly put this on. These are the kind of, you probably can't see this, but I'll make the slides available. These are some of the issues that researchers face, so things like overselling their research to get it published, maybe not having the right p-values in the actual work, things like not publishing work properly, as in if it's negative, null, people don't share it. And then there's many cases of inventing data and retractions and all the kind of issues. But basically, Richard Smith, again, I don't know if anyone's mentioned, I don't know if he's been mentioned, but basically he's kind of very vocal on this issue, but the whole issue is that, you know, the research, the problems with a lot of scholarly publishing is basically because of the currency for researchers. And then this is another area that I see is changing quite a lot, is the use of peer review. I also started to use the word experts because I think peer review is an interesting term. Not everyone agrees with me. I'm speaking on my own behalf here, but I kind of think grant agencies, scholarly publishing needs to really think about how and when they use experts to actually comment on research. I think sometimes we apply old models of peer review in a very blunt way, and we use the same model at different stages of research, and I think we should think about that. There's a number of studies. Digital Science published a research piece, I think it was last year, basically looking at how you'd start again and some of the problems with publishing peer review. But again, it's totally pervasive in the grant funding community as well. A number of studies that have showed that actually peer review and how you use experts in the grant funding process is also a need for kind of more openness and looking at how and when to use experts. Sort of more positively, although I kind of think that this is all showing that we need to sort of start looking at this differently, and we are looking at things differently. There's a massive push from funding agencies who are getting more involved in promoting different ways of publishing, and they're taking more ownership of ensuring that the research that they've funded, a lot of the research that they have funded is a taxpayers' kind of expense. It's either public funded, or many private agencies also get certain tax exemptions. So they have total public incentives to actually make sure that the research is used and their money is used wisely. There's also policy mandates from the EU and things like the FAIR data sharing approaches. So there's lots of kind of pushes as well to just be more open, be more rapid, be more kind of inclusive and collaborative. Somebody else just mentioned this as well, citizen science. This is a massive thing. It's actually basically saying we need to be more inclusive and less academic about actually research, because the whole point is that it's for people to have a better life, to improve quality of life, to improve knowledge. It's not of its own right, something. So it's important for kind of to make sure that people are able to engage with it. So there's tons of examples of how to get researchers and to engage with the general population and what are people's priorities and issues. And then the big thing, if you go back to sort of funding, the whole point, and I think sometimes we get a bit lost in sort of academic debates about what's wrong with scholarly publishing, is the whole point is about making impact. Publishing is a way to communicate the research findings, and I think we sometimes forget that publishing is part of an infrastructure with funding agencies, with learned societies, with the public, with research performing institutions. And when I came from a funding background to work with a publisher, you really see that there's not been as much linkage and working together between the different components of the whole ecosystem to bring about impact quicker. And a lot of the problems that I think I see is they're often process issues, they're often miscommunication, and I think there's lots of examples throughout this whole meeting of where that collaboration is really kind of helping. But the whole point is that we're trying to do things quicker to kind of improve quality of life and understanding, and for the benefit of science and everybody. So this isn't taken in Singapore Harbour, but it could have been, because it's very beautiful down there, and there was lots of fireworks last night. But there was lots of kind of new models emerging, and again, we've heard about quite a few of these over the meeting. And I think I've got lots of examples of this. Science is being shared in a very different way than it traditionally is, and it's not all within scholarly published journals. A couple of the drivers, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of drivers that we see. So one of the main pushes is that actually traditional processes are very slow, and there's a real push to kind of do things quicker. So can we speed up how we use experts, how manuscript submission systems work, and when research can be made public and available for others to use? So everyone's talked a little bit again about, I put preprint in single inverted commas because I actually don't like the term, but anyway, it describes something. But you can see there's been a massive growth. This is from ASP Bio. This is the growth of bioRxiv and Archive and all the other kind of platforms. It's included the platform F1000 Research, which is the publishing platform that I work with. But essentially, you can see that there's been a massive growth, particularly in the last 3 years. And this is basically researchers sharing work outside of journals. But there's a whole raft of other things in terms of things like blogs and people's websites and all kinds of ways of sharing research differently. This is something that we're seeing, which I think helps to address some of the issues. And again, I think Adam talked about some of these things, about actually having new partnerships and basically thinking about things differently and bolting together kind of collaborations where they kind of make sense. So F1000 itself, this is my only plug. We are basically doing a publishing platforms. We're working as a service directly for funding agencies and some research performing institutions. So we are essentially providing a publishing service to funding agencies to basically say to their researchers, anyone connected to either the ones that we're working with at the moment or the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation and the Health Research Board in Ireland, which is a clinical research funder, and then 2 institutions, the Montreal Neurological Institute and a kind of institute within the University College in London. Essentially to say, we will provide you with all the independent kind of services that we as a publisher are kind of used to. So we'll do independent peer review. We actually do post-publication open peer review. But we will provide those services for you to get work out quickly. So we publish within 7 days, but we peer review it afterwards. So it's kind of a preprint model with peer review involved. But essentially, it's us partnering with a funding agency. We know that there's a lot of content, a lot of research that researchers who have been funded already by these agencies and peer-reviewed, that they just find it difficult to share, and it takes a long time, and we're seeing quite a lot of uptake within, particularly within Wellcome, which has been running the longest. And then these are two other models that kind of looking at peer review differently. So on the left side, Cancer Research UK in the UK are working with the Journal of Nicotine and Tobacco Research. Essentially, anything that comes into a funding program within cancer research that's related to tobacco and nicotine addiction will be peer reviewed by the same people at the grant level, and then as pieces of the research come out throughout into that journal. So basically what they're doing is using the same people to kind of review the grant, review the protocols, review every stage of it. So basically you're taking the context with you right the way through, and you're making sure that you've funded it and you've got the right p-values, you've got the right sample right at the beginning, instead of kind of having different people jumping in at different points. There are risks associated with that, but it's a pilot. They're looking at how efficient that makes it and whether it makes it easier for the funding agency to find peer reviewers and also for the journal to find peer reviewers. And PLOS One are doing something very similar with the Children's Tumour Foundation. And then the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is growth for kind of open peer review. This is another interesting thing because I think people aren't really clear about what they mean by open peer review, and there are many, many flavors of what open actually means. So there's open, totally transparent, you know who the peer reviewers are for everything, or you make it open when it's been published. And I think that there's definitely room for lots of different models, but it is kind of interesting. But there's a growth for support for transparency throughout peer review, both for publication and again for grants. So if we can start to sort of think about how to link those things together, there seems to be a lot of redundancy that could be kind of replaced. And then the other thing that's really interesting, and I'm just going to focus, and then it brings it back to kind of a lot of the work that Crossref is doing, is I think what we're seeing as well is instead of articles being the only currency, we're not looking at journal impact factors, we're looking at articles being article level metrics, but actually we're going beyond that as well, because now you can cite your data in its own right, it has its own DOI. So if you're a author or a contributor who was really key on producing a piece of data for a funding agency, you have your own DOI that's linked to that data set. That might be not published in an article, it might have its own life, and that's actually really important that you can track an individual output, maybe outside of a kind of a journal system as well. So we need to think about how DOIs of different types of research outputs can be used to support funding agencies and researchers. This is something that's happening in, these are for microorganisms and kind of cell lines and things like that. So basically, again, having DOIs and specific things on people's cell lines so that, again, somebody who spent the time curating that will get the credit for it outside of a journal, again, and outside of an article, potentially. So this is kind of interesting. Someone showed some work on altmetrics yesterday, but again, you can start to look at the kind of reach of this is just a data set. So it's kind of a piece of data that was stored in Zenodo. You can get all the data on that piece of data. I think this was published in an article, but it doesn't need to be, so it's kind of interesting how you can actually get metrics on a data set even if it wasn't published in an article. So just to kind of bring this back together, what this all means is that we need information to connect it all together. So infrastructure and metadata are kind of absolutely key to this. When I was working in a funding agency, you kind of see that there's, you don't need to read all this, but there's basically infrastructure is key for researchers, research institutions, publishers, and funders, and they're all part of the same ecosystem, and they're all wanting to connect information together. If you just focus specifically on research funders, the key thing is that they want to support how they evaluate grants that come to them, and how they evaluate the progress of grants once they've been funded and beyond the grant. So they know for strategic reasons what's the best things to fund. Maybe they know which things are going to fly. How can they reduce research duplication? How can they identify new opportunities and set strategy and prioritization? The key thing is that they need information to know what's happened to what they've already funded and what's coming in. So ORCID's being key. So a lot of funding agencies are really trying to get involved in ORCID. There's been a little slowness in mandating adoption of ORCID, but Wellcome has mandated it. So everybody who has a grant from the Wellcome Trust will have to get an ORCID ID. The same for a number of agencies in Europe, including the FWF in Austria, and there's a number of other agencies doing it, and NIH are now trying to have a real push to get ORCIDs, but it's a really easy way for funding agencies to start to connect their researchers to their outputs and their grants. This is basically the benefits of ORCID for funders. You might have seen this before, but there's lots of practical reasons why you need ORCID IDs for grant holders. But essentially, it's to try and make things more efficient, more connected, so you can start to do the kind of information connecting and prioritization. So the metadata 2020 kind of thing is absolutely key. And these are some of the things that I was sort of thinking about are the key things for funding agencies to have. So getting the funding registry, getting that kind of revamped is fantastic, and getting more funders involved. I know there's a real interest from funding agencies to get involved in that. Having ORCIDs and kind of links to who's the team involved in the research, and the organisation ID has been, it's just absolutely key to trying to have that information. Most funding agencies kind of have invented their own, and you kind of try and bring that together. So I can understand the sort of challenges that Paul faces in sort of thinking about the scope for that, but it is something that would be massively useful to funding agencies. And then having DOIs around all of the outputs, but also thinking about how to link specific components of research, so research data, research software, and the articles, and all the kinds of other bits to try and have DOIs around outputs in a more holistic and connected way is key. But I think just go back to the whole thing. The whole point of what we're trying to do is do science more effectively, and Crossref plays a role in that, as do all those kind of other agencies. And until we can start to sort of connect it and build this picture, I don't think we will get anywhere close to kind of trying to reduce some of this redundancy and research waste. So it's absolutely key to have good metadata around all the outputs. So that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully that gives a bit of a whistle stop. I think there's a lot of recurring themes come throughout the meeting. So I'm happy to answer any questions or thoughts that anyone might have. Thank you.